The most common thing to hijack is someone's browser session. So someone opens a browser to a website, and the most common thing we can do is to hijack that, as opposed to hijacking a TCP network session, but we'll talk about that soon too. So let's talk about browser session hijacking. We need to understand first how browser authentication works. There are two basic mechanisms. There's the old style cookie-based authentication. Now, a cookie is just a text file. And what happens with a cookie is this. Your browser, you open a browser, you visit a website, okay? Now that website is going to have a database. At least most of them do. So let's say you go to an online shopping portal, Amazon or something like that, eBay. You go there, and when you make a connection, the website slips your browser a cookie. It's just a text file with a number in it, or a string in it. And a string is just any length of characters, letters and numbers. So your browser accepts the cookie, unless you've configured your browser to not accept the cookie, in which the website probably won't talk to you. But your browser takes the cookie. Now, the website has a database that has an entry that says, okay, that particular cookie, that particular identifier, that string identifier, I'm going to create an entry in my database, and I'm going to track everything that user does, what they click, what they view, how they move around, because we're going to use that information to build a profile on that user and offer them basically marketing. So I'm looking around, I'm clicking this, I'm clicking that, I'm viewing this, that, and the other. And I go away. And I come back in a little bit. And when I come back, the web server goes to my browser, do you have a cookie for me? And the browser hands the cookie, assuming I haven't destroyed the cookie, which a user would have to do deliberately. Otherwise, the browser hangs on to the cookie. And you can find cookies. They're just text files with an @ symbol in them. So anyway, in the name. So my browser hands the cookie back to the web server. The web server compares the identifier in the cookie to the entries in the database and goes, aha, this one. And suddenly I, as a consumer, see, welcome, Chris, and here are 5 new books that might interest you. And this is the way all websites work. Now, let's talk about this in terms of authentication, because cookies don't have to just be used to track our user behavior. They can also keep our session alive. You see, the HTTP protocol is what we call stateless. It doesn't, even though it's a payload of TCP, HTTP itself does not keep a session going. So you need to somehow identify that user, that browser, every time they come back. So the cookie is also a very common authentication mechanism for somebody. I mean, have you ever surfed off of Amazon and then come right back in without having to provide a username and password? Yeah, of course you have, because you have session cookies. So when we look here, cookie-based authentication, this is a mechanism to make your web authentication stateful, meaning we can track it from beginning to end. So the lifetime of a cookie goes like this. The user logs in for the first time. The server verifies that the user is correct, the username and password are correct, and they create a session, which they then log in the database. Then this cookie, this little text file with a session ID, which is just a string, is given to the user's browser. As we come back on subsequent requests, the browser presents the cookie with the session ID, the database verifies it and says, oh, okay, you've authenticated, you're valid. Do you see the opportunity right now? If someone managed to steal the cookie, they could impersonate us. So right off the bat, there's a risk there, isn't there? So if a user logs out of the app, actually logs out, then the session is destroyed on both the client side and the server side. But very often we surf away without logging out. So this is the old cookie-based authentication. It was used, traditionally it was used for a long time, but it has been replaced now by something called token-based authentication, which is a little bit different. Now a token is usually a JSON web token. It's not for this class to get into JSON, but basically a JSON object is just a key value pair. It's just like a number with some kind of string. So it's a database entry of just a key and some kind of value. And anyway, it is a digitally signed JSON object. That's what a JSON Web Token, a JWT, is. This kind of authentication is stateless. The server does not keep a record of which users are logged in. It does not keep track of which JWTs have been issued. Every request to the server is accompanied by the token, which the server uses to verify the authenticity of the request. So the server doesn't validate this. It just goes, JWT, okay, it's one of mine, good, come on in. It doesn't like validate this against some kind of user database, or rather some kind of user session database. The reason why we have this now, it's been much more convenient for little single-page applications, web APIs. API is just like little buttons of functionality when one application wants another application to do something. Or small devices like Internet of Things. It's a simpler, less cumbersome mechanism. So it's become more popular just kind of de facto, not because of any standards, but just kind of the way things have evolved. So the lifetime of a token goes like this. It's very similar to a cookie. I log in. I enter my login credentials at the website. The server verifies I'm an actual user with the correct username and password, and it gives me a digitally signed token, which is a key value pair. Now the thing is that the token can actually be put in a lot of places. It can either be put in my own local client-side storage, or it can also be put in a cookie if you want. So it's stored on my side, the way a cookie is, usually in my own little local storage for my browser. It can be stored other places. It can be actually the data in a cookie itself. Every time I go back to the server, I go and I present, now not me the user, but my browser, presents this token. And it's part of the authorization header of my web request. And it comes through some other method I'm trying, one of these other methods. The server decodes the JWT and goes, aha, the token is valid. And it processes whatever my request is. When I log out, and here's the stateless part of it, the token is destroyed on my side. The server doesn't care. So this is what we have evolved to now as tokens. But you can run across either cookies or tokens. Either way, they're both stealable. So what is a session token? Well, this is another term for using a JSON Web Token. HTTP communications are stateless, and they can use many TCP connections. So if you go to a website, if you really look at it, you'll see all these frames in the website, and some have banners going, and some have feeds, and some have this, and some have that. These are all actually multiple TCP, HTTP sessions being presented in a single browser. So a typical web connection will have multiple connections going on at the same time, but the user only sees one browser. But the user does see all these little elements all over that are actually independent little parts. So an HTTP session uses many TCP connections. So the web server needs a way to recognize every single one of these little connections. And that's what the token is used for. So this is the most useful way of doing that. So the web server sends the token to the client browser after the original user authentication. And the token can actually be in the URL. It can be in the header of an HTTP request. It can be in a cookie. It could be in other parts of the header of the HTTP request. It could be in the body of the HTTP request. And so session hijacking means you're grabbing the session token or grabbing the cookie. So we steal or we predict what the next session token will be. We steal an existing one, like maybe the tokens go up a certain way and we can just guess at what the next one will be. Either way, we, just like a cookie, we have taken over someone else's valid session, giving us unauthorized access to that web server. So how do you compromise a session token? Well, you can either watch it and just guess what the next number will be. You can sniff and just steal it that way. And there are any number of client-side attacks, which we're going to talk about some of them soon. There are also attacks such as man in the middle and man in the browser. So now let's go on to those various methods.